according to the report, the separation of migrant children from their parents, sometimes for months, was at the heart of the Trump administration's policy on immigration. But the backlash that the administration received after struggling to reunite the children turned into one of the biggest policy debacles of President Trump's term. Now, the draft report, citing more than 45 interviews with key officials, emails, and other documents, provides the most complete look at the discussions inside the Justice Department as the family separation policy was developed and then carried out. And to help break down this 86-page draft report and interviews, we're actually bringing in the CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refuge Service, Krish Vignarajah. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. First, I want to know, is there anything in this report that surprised you?
Unfortunately, no. I mean, we already had heard accounts of how this was a deliberative process, that officials knew that children would be separated en masse. But this was just confirmation. The report highlighted memos that had been written. It highlighted that 5 U.S. attorneys, including 3 appointed by the Trump administration, had flagged the real concerns that we ultimately all knew about. So it was really just verification for much of what had already come out about this atrocious family separation policy.
Now, what were some of the glaring differences in the Obama-era policies on immigration and the Trump administration policies?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think we have to acknowledge that there had been a very small pilot and discussion of family separation even under the Obama administration. But what we saw under the Trump administration was there was another pilot that was undertaken in Texas. And after that, there was a decision to institute this policy across the border, which is how you had, 5,300 children affected by this policy, including 300 under the age of 5. But the other difference I think I would just note is that every level of leadership of this administration was part of the process. And so, the report highlights that we had a cabinet meeting in the White House Situation Room, where of the 12 officials that were presented with family separation as an administration policy, 11 out of 12 agreed to institute this policy. And the one exception, Nielsen, made the decision to sign off on the policy the day after. And I think that just reflects, what is leadership right now in the U.S. government. Many of these individuals were parents, they were grandparents, and yet they decided to go ahead with this policy.
Now, in what way can threatening to remove and detain children influence those who are actually seeking asylum and immigration?
Yeah, I mean, the sad reality is, this is not a deterrence. The people who are fleeing their countries are fleeing for their lives. They are coming to the U.S. to seek refuge from human trafficking, gang violence, persecution based on religion or other reasons. And so this policy, it's not done for rule of law reasons. In fact, the report's really interesting because it highlights that U.S. attorneys emphasize that this could risk, sexual predators being put out on the streets. You had Customs and Border Patrol agents who couldn't go after serious felons because they were told to prioritize these, misdemeanors. And that's where I think it's just really sad, because it's not done for rule of law, and it's not done as a deterrent policy because it's completely ineffective, in addition to, of course, being inhumane.
And what does mitigating the damage to separated families actually look like?
Yeah, I mean, the sad fact is that right now we still don't have a great sense of what the actual number of children who are still separated from their parents. The ACLU puts that number at about 1,000. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service was one of the 2 agencies that the government turned to reunify children 2 summers ago. And, we were able to reunify the children that we knew about. But because the government did a terrible job of trying to account for the children as they were separated, we still don't know the full number. The other piece is that, the outrage 2 summers ago when this policy happened, which led to it being ended, I think we just have to remember that still today we have variants of this policy that we face. So there are still children who are illegally being held in family detention, and ICE has refused to let the parents also be released. And so the parents right now are facing an impossible choice, which is keep the children with them in family detention during a pandemic, or release them and be separated from the children. And it doesn't have to be this way.
Now, does the report show any policy that had any positive effect, like stopping human trafficking?
No. I think the only kind of positive glimmer that I could read from the report was that you did have several officials in government who were indicating, flagging the concerns. We had U.S. attorneys who said to their top officials in DOJ and DHS, are you sure that you want us to be taking breastfeeding children away from their parents? And so I hope that at least shows that there are some decent, humane people in government still. But the sad reality is that when you look at the political appointees who made this decision, they knew that that family separation wasn't going to be just an unintended byproduct, but it was the intended goal of the policy.
Now, who is actually responsible for the logistics of family separation? Because the DOJ says that they prosecute but don't provide, they don't track or provide custodial care. So what does that accountability process look like?
Yeah, that was part of why this was such a mess, because you had DOJ saying that they were only responsible for the adults, the parents that they were prosecuting. And then you had Department of Homeland Security, as well as Health and Human Services, who were debating who was actually going to take responsibility for tracking the children as they were separated. And the sad fact is you have Stephen Miller in this May 2018 meeting basically saying, I don't want to get bogged down with the logistics, the reality that we're going to separate children and we may not know how we reunify them. And so even though DHS and HHS were pointing the finger at one another and there was no system in place, they still forged ahead with the policy. But the truth is that all three of those agencies should have been responsible for the serious and devastating ramifications of separating these children and trying to reunify them, rather than what they did, which was turn to private entities like my nonprofit to reunify the children.
Krish, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us here on NBC LX.
Thanks for having me.